Well, hello and welcome back to the Lamppost Listener. My name is Daniel.
I'm Phil.
And this is a podcast where we journey chapter by chapter through C.S. Lewis's Chronicles of Narnia. This is chapter 3 of The Last Battle, The Ape in Its Glory.
That's right. This is it.
You don't have anything else to say? This is it? We see kind of the culmination.
We're not monkeying around anymore.
I was just waiting. I just
Apes
felt
aren't
like
monkeys.
There was something on the tip of your tongue there. This is kind of the culmination of all of Schiff's plans throughout, just the first two chapters. But within two chapters, this ape has already gotten to the pinnacle of where he wants to be. He has complete and total power over the Narnians.
Right. And he promised to hand back his emergency powers once the
Clone Wars were over.
Yeah.
Tell me this, Phil. Reading through chapter 3, were you
picturing Andy Serkis?
No, I was
and thinking of how to get in contact with him for this episode? Yes, I was.
going to ask you. Are you surprised by two things? One, and maybe you're not surprised. I'd love to know, are you surprised that no children in the book at all by chapter 3 and no sign of children appearing, at least right now? And second, the fact that things are just consistently getting worse. Nothing good happened in this chapter yet.
I'm not surprised. I'm impressed. Because once again, this is the seventh book that we've read in the series. It's the last book, and he's doing something different again, and I still feel like it works. Now, I haven't read the whole book, but I'm assuming that it still works. Isn't this the most polarizing story? I feel like this one hardly ever gets mentioned.
Didn't we say back in chapter 1? I think I pulled some Goodreads reviews. Yes, it is definitely the most polarizing. It is the Last Jedi, if you will, of the I'm trying to just think. Is there like Wardrobe, Nephew, Dawn Treader, and Silverchair pretty universally loved. The Horse and His Boy maybe a little bit less universally loved, but a lot of people still really like it. And I don't know of anyone who really dislikes it. I'm sure there are people. I don't know of a large, vocal group of people like, oh, this book's terrible. And same with Prince Caspian, which a lot of people don't necessarily love as much. But there's a good amount of people who are bothered by this book.
I would also be curious to see the stats on how many people have read the entire series and how many people have read 4 books.
Interesting.
Because I feel like I fell into the crowd of I've read 4 of the books and 3 to 4.
I'd read 6 until just a few years ago.
Right. Yeah. And so like if people aren't finishing the series, this seems like the most likely one to not be read. So maybe that's why it's not talked about as much on a grand scale.
Sure.
I feel like the people listening to this show for the most part have probably read all the books at this point.
Yeah, that would be interesting we've had a couple people reach out over the years who have said, I'm reading these books for the first time. And I have not, but I always want to follow up with like, how did you find this podcast? Like, Did you find the podcast first and then decide to read the books? Which seems like it's hard to believe that would be the case. But at the same time, like, did you just pick up a brand new series and were like, I also want to I guess probably that's more likely is I'm reading a new series and I want to read it with other people as a little book club. Yeah. Maybe that makes more sense. Well,
I get that feeling. When I'm starting something, I'm looking for, does anyone want to read this with me? Just because it's easy to start right now. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I am, as someone who's read this book, obviously, multiple times before, reading it again as we're doing the podcast, I am just surprised at how different it feels. Having spent so much time studying and reading and discussing the other 6 books, I'm now coming to The Last Battle with just a renewed kind of, in a good way, disappointment at what's happening in the story. Not disappointment in that it's bad, but not disappointment. Maybe just like grief and saying, this world that we have loved so much is being just completely devastated through the lies of this ape and through just some of the horrific things we're seeing here.
It also, for some reason, feels like it has really strong connections to today, which is surprising for a book that was written in the 50s. But just the way language is being changed, or the way people are saying it's this thing even though it's not. And we're seeing it with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and it's being called one thing. and it's clearly not that thing. It's being called that by Russia, and they're calling it something counter to what it actually is. And we're seeing terms redefined here, and it's terrifying because it feels very relevant to today.
There is this, even outside of just like geopolitical conflict that you're mentioning, there is this sense of, and Lewis is obviously thinking mostly of modernity in this chapter, but as we've gotten into postmodernity and whatever we live in now, there is this sense of a lack of objective truth has undermined some of the most basic things we believe. There's questions that every human being could have answered pretty simply 300 years ago that we struggle to do now. And it's because there's just objective truth in very like Lewis's abolition of man, that hideous strength type of way, that we have just questioned, well, how can we believe that that's absolute truth? And the fact that this Chesterton's idea of the democracy, or is that Chesterton or MacDonald now that I'm thinking about it? I think it's Chesterton. The democracy of the dead, of kind of honoring those who came before us, we've because we reject that and we say, no, it's always about progress, we no longer can feel confident. Well, we feel confident answering this question this way because that's how our forefathers did it. That no longer holds any weight. Right. We haven't even gotten to the chapter summary yet.
Well, so in teaching at a classical school, do you get modernity leave where you get to read stuff that's from the past century?
That would be great. If I ever become a head of school, I will make sure that that's written into the I don't know if a board would be very happy with me if I'm taking like legal contracts and like putting puns into them. Well, let's go ahead. Let me read the chapter summary, and then we'll get deeper into some of these questions. There's a lot. I've got some great things to pull from and discuss with you today that I'm just really excited to hear your thoughts on.
And do you want to share what you're drinking? I feel like that's a fun tradition we picked up from our friends at Pints of Jack.
I have.
This is 4-year-old coffee.
The coffee I have right.
Sorry, 4-hour-old coffee.
Yeah, I was gonna say the coffee was old when I walked it over to your house 3 hours ago. Yeah. So it's Blanchard's coffee, which is always great, and we enjoy Blanchard's a lot. But yeah, I mean, I'm just drinking just black coffee. I think it was Handshake is one of their blends that we really like. You've got just a giant.
And I have
You have an extra long Nalgene water bottle.
Extra large Nalgene with 1/3 tap water and 2/3 air.
One of the reasons that you and I don't regularly ask each other what we're drinking
is because it's so boring.
It's usually, well, I would say right now we're recording closer to late morning, mid-afternoon-ish time. I actually don't know what time it is anymore, but
it's 1:24.
Okay, but we started, around, I think I walked over at 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, I think. And no, you're making a face. Was it not that time?
11:20.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So I'll often, if we're recording in the afternoon, I'll get something a little bit heartier, right? We might have a glass of whiskey or maybe a beer or something. But I'm not a 11 o'clock beer guy. That's no thanks. That's not for me.
Me either.
So then it's just boring drinks, All right. Well, let's move on now to the chapter summary. This is for chapter 3. Here we go. Tyrion and Jewel, remorseful over the killing of defenseless Calormans, surrender to their enemies. After being bound with ropes, they are brought before Shift. The ape, dressed in marvelous human robes, addresses the talking beasts around him. He explains that Aslan plans on selling them to the Tisroc and Calormen. Horrified by this revelation, the talking beasts ask Shift many questions. The ape, frustrated with these questions, explains that they do not truly understand freedom. He continues to explain that Tash and Aslan are actually the same person, no different from each other. Tyrion finally speaks up and indignantly curses Shift. In response, the Calormen guards knock Tyrion unconscious.
Well done. This is an intense chapter, and what we were discussing is that it gets worse. The first chapter was hard, the second chapter is hard, and this one piles on. I'm really hoping there is a glimpse, at least, of redemption coming up in the next chapter.
But I mean, nothing so far.
Nothing so far.
Chapters.
It's just dark.
It even ends with, our main characters really, they get a little bit to say on the first page or two of the chapter, And then at the very end, Tyrion speaks up. But the majority of this chapter is a dialogue between Shift and these. It's not even really a dialogue. It's a lecture between Shift with a few questions aloud from the talking beasts. Well, before we get to that conversation, let's talk about Tyrion and Jewel, who actually start this chapter running away. They've killed these two Calormans. We learned that they died suddenly, or silently, suddenly and silently.
Well, yeah, without a cry.
Exactly. And so they have a moment to actually escape, and Jewel has Tyrion on his back, and they begin running away, and they escape. They make it away before Tyrion has kind of a change of heart. Tell me about this.
Yeah, he mounts Jewel and then realizes, no, he's like, let me down. This isn't right. And they decide that they're going to go back and turn themselves in.
Were you surprised by this?
I think I was still surprised by the fact that a murder happened so quickly in this story at all. And this seems like and what they did is really bad, but it seems like it is not the thing that it defines their character. And that they were in the heat of the moment, and now they are realizing this doesn't match up with what's right. We still want to do what's right, even though we did something terrible, and they're going to go turn themselves in as a result.
Yeah, I'm intrigued by the way that Lewis depicts their shame, their guilt here. And it is both shame and guilt, which obviously are not the same thing, in having killed these Calormans. It's also interesting given the context that we've read an entire book that told us how bad the Calormans are. Like, we know that this is a culture that values slavery, that values, that has a very strong hierarchy, and not kind of a good hierarchy, but one that's very oppressive, right? And, at first glance, you read, well, the killing of, the enemy, the bad guys in a story is clearly a good thing, and Tyrion's the good king. So you would maybe read this as a fairy story for children and think, the king killed the bad guys. But so quickly, Tyrion says, no, like, we killed these people in cold blood. We're not at war with Calormen.
We didn't give them a chance. We didn't
even ask them what's going on, right? Yeah. Now, we did see them whipping this horse, right? It reminds me somewhat, I honestly don't remember if we made this connection last chapter, but it reminds me of the beginning of Exodus, where Moses kills an Egyptian, right? We know that obviously the Egyptians are oppressing and enslaving the Israelites, but one of the ways that biblical scholars and theologians think through this is that, like, what Moses did, he murdered a guy, right? And I think some of the translations, I can't remember, like the ESV or the Revised Standard or any of the editions, what verbs they use, but I feel pretty certain that I've read at least one translation that used the word, like, he murders him instead of just he kills him. Like, murder kind of has obviously that kind of that weight to it, right? Of like, this is a negative thing, as opposed to there are times when Lewis would say this as someone who's not a pacifist, where killing is the right thing to do. But murder is different, right? Murder's a negative, it's a pejorative word. So what's interesting here is the connection I'm making just between, and I'm sure I'm not the first to do this, is this connection between kind of Moses's lack of unrighteousness then, but realizing relatively quickly, like, I've done something wrong. He runs away. He doesn't go back to Egypt for a very long time, obviously, but Tyrion just goes literally hilt extended outward right back to the Calormens and turns himself in. It's interesting that he does this, and obviously a lot of it's for a narrative perspective. We need to get him with Shift so that we can hear these things, right? But also, he could have run away and still felt really bad, but not have turned himself in and say, well, I'm the king. It is, my duty to lead my people, and there probably is going to be war with the Calormens now. I need to go back to Cair Paravel and prepare for a battle with these people. But instead, he takes it upon himself to do this. And I am really intrigued. I want to read what the two say as to his main reason for this, for both him and for Jewel. Tyrion says this: would it not be better to be dead than to have this horrible fear that Aslan has come and is not like the Aslan we have believed in and longed for? It is as if the sun rose one day and were a black sun. And then Jewel continues that it's like drinking water if it were dry water. This is almost the opposite of what occurs with Puddleglum in chapter 12 of The Silver Chair, right? Where Puddleglum's saying, I want to believe in Aslan even if there is no Aslan. The inverse of that here is Tyrion and Jules saying, I don't want to believe in Aslan if, or not, I don't want to believe, but I don't know what to believe if Aslan isn't good. If Aslan is actually ordering all these things, then this clearly undermines everything we've ever believed. We thought Aslan was good, and what's clearly happening is not good. And so because of that, we might as well just go turn ourselves in. This is clearly the end, right?
Yeah.
It's interesting.
And what an interesting way to craft a story at the end of this. Is it a septology?
I guess so.
Yeah, we have these 7 books.
I think you usually just say series. Or, better yet, Chronicles.
Ah, the Chronicles. What a novel term. No pun intended, but intended. We have 6 books where we know that Aslan's good. We know that this isn't really Aslan because this doesn't match up with Aslan's character, and we saw how the fake Aslan was created with this lion skin. But yeah, it's a real dark time and a real big shift. And I think that, the sun being dark or water being dry is just something is not right here. But it just seems like this is real, and already it's caused a lot of bad things to happen. So yeah, I'm really curious how we start getting out of here, because this is different also in that the characters aren't being separated from their place and then working their way back or going on a journey. They've already turned themselves in, and they're staying in one place.
What's interesting, and honestly, I have not decided whether I think this is a good quality in these two characters or a negative quality, is Jewel even says, if Aslan is not Aslan, what's left for us? Or he says, what's left for me, I think is his exact words. So if Aslan is not Aslan, then everything doesn't matter. So like if this truth that I have believed my whole life and have been told for generations and generations actually isn't real, then nothing matters, right? And this kind of Platonic idea, I've escaped the cave, right? Only to realize everything I thought I believed was wrong. And Jules' response is not to run back into the cave and say, hey, everybody, you come out. Actually, what we believed is wrong. His response is, wow, it's almost like Nietzschean in a way of like, then nothing matters. Yeah. And I'm at first it sounds like, oh, that's definitely a negative quality. But at the same time, it's like his belief and his faith in Aslan is so strong and great that if he finds out that isn't true, he's like, well, then what was, it doesn't feel defeatist and like, well, nothing matters. It's like, well, then I don't want it again. I don't want to live. So it is actually, now that I'm actually saying it out loud, it still is quite similar to Puddleglum. Yeah. If Aslan isn't Aslan, then I don't want to exist. I don't want to live in a world where Aslan isn't Aslan. And that's actually what Puddleglum's saying, right? I'd rather spend all my time up on the upper world, or what is he called, overland, searching for Aslan, even if he doesn't exist, than live in your world where you say he doesn't. So actually, it is similar now that I'm saying it out loud.
Yeah, it kind of seems like if there's truly no God, then like push that all the way to its conclusion.
Yeah, the reductio ad nauseam, right?
Yeah, and it doesn't matter. Which is a very loaded topic, but I think this is an interesting way to portray that, where we're 3 chapters in, we're already seeing that's his conclusion. Okay, if it's not real, then none of this is important.
That's well said. So we move on from here, and Tyrion and Jewel are brought to Shift. They're brought to Shift, and kind of there's just like this stable, this hut that's like a stable, I think is what Lewis writes, or the narrator writes here. And we see Shift all dressed up to look like a human. And this reminds me, he'll go on and say it later. I'm getting a slightly ahead of myself, but he will go on and say later that, I'm not an ape, I'm a man, which is very reminiscent of our very first villain in the Chronicles, Jadis, right? Who we learn is half djinn, half giantess, but likes to think of herself as human, right? In the same way of this kind of these non-humans, these imposters, right, trying to kind of appeal to goodness by being something that they aren't, which I really love. And I love the way that he's depicted in the illustration and in Lewis's description here. But ironically, or hilariously, as the king of Narnia is literally brought before him, Shift has way more important things to deal with. And what is one of these important things?
He is eating nuts, and he's also ordering more because he has eaten so many that he's running out.
He's not ordering more. Aslan is ordering
right.
more.
Okay. Well, it depends on who you're going to listen to.
It's true. It's a little comical here as he goes through these things. We learn that the head squirrel is really upset by this because they don't have enough nuts for him. And I think what's really funny in the way that Lewis displays this is just the way that what is really an awful thing, like Shift is just, he's not even demonic or diabolical. He's just self-serving. Like none of this is about taking over the world. It's literally only about, it's not even like he's super interested in having power over others. He does seem to enjoy that, but it's power over others just to kind of lead this hedonistic lifestyle. It's like that's all he wants. He just wants like hedonism, you know?
He just wants to live for his own pleasure.
And in this conversation, what we hear is one of the boars asks, why can't we see Aslan? Why can't we talk to him? He used to in the old stories appear and talk to others, and now you're saying he doesn't. And Shift's response to this is that he's been too soft on you in the past, right? And he says he's going to lick you into shape this time. He'll teach you to think he's a tame lion, which is so interesting. He's going to teach you to think that he's a tame lion. And it made me think about, being in Sunday school when you're a kid, growing up, and for those that did, or for adults struggling with this too, kind of this idea of trying to reconcile a loving God with a just God, right? This idea that God is love. And so the Bible says, right, God is, I think this was that 1 John, says God is love. And yet there are many examples in the Bible where God's actions, from my human perspective, my limited, ignorant human perspective, I'm like, oh, that doesn't seem loving, right? Or that seems judgmental. That seems condemning, right? And when you're sitting there, 6th, 7th, 8th grader, kind of in those, that's the years I think a lot of people kind of really begin wrestling deeply with this. It feels similar to what Shift is saying. It's like, well, you've thought too long that he's a loving and tame and kind, but he hasn't been hard enough on you. Yeah. And when we think about this from a biblical perspective, God has been hard on his people from our perspective, right? It might very much seem that way. And the idea of understanding what it really means for God to be just and what that means is the way that he has to deal with human sin is complicated. It's a little confusing,
It's very confusing.
Yeah. And so I think that some of what Shift is doing is he's kind of preying upon that to these animals of that. I'm sure that some of them have that same difficulty in being like, well, like, why are bad things happening if God is good, or if God is love, why is this happening? Or why did this happen in the stories about God or about Aslan? And so it can be really easily manipulated to be like, no. He actually is a hard, tough God. It's not about him being loving. And so it's easy for these people to fall back into that trap, for this, these beasts to fall into that lie, because there's a little bit of worry already probably there in their minds.
Right. Yeah, I heard a coworker, this was years ago, share that their impression of church was there were two things. One, sex was bad, and two, here are all the rules, and you can't, like, you're not following the rules. Mm-hmm. And it's interesting because I was just blown away by what they were saying, and I thought that's not what the message is.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that is really what was being said or if that's how you interpret it. It's probably a mix of both. But it's tough. We have a bunch of flawed people in some ways trying, but also in some ways using things in the Bible to benefit themselves, or they're not communicating it correctly.
Yeah.
For whatever reason.
What's really interesting as this conversation goes on is that Shift eventually, he doesn't even really let it slide. He just thinks that it's going to be just probably well received. He explains that this work is not going to end anytime soon. In fact, Aslan has settled it with the king of Calormen, the Tisroc, right? That they are all going to go work for the Tisroc in his mines, in which case the beasts kind of say, hey, no, we don't want to be slaves. The interesting response, right, to this from Shift, in response to hearing that these animals believe they're about to be sold into slavery, he's like, no. You're not going to be slaves. You're going to get paid. Now, you're not going to get the money. The money's going to go to this kind of collective treasury that Aslan will use for everybody's good, right?
Gosh.
And in helping make the country of Narnia a better place, he's going to say there's going to be oranges and bananas and roads and big cities and schools and offices and whips and muzzles and saddles and cages and kennels and prisons. Oh, everything. Which is very much the kind of governmental bureaucracy that Lewis has regularly railed against throughout these books. And I think this is a great place for us to pause for a moment and talk about a man who came up back in chapter 1, who I think a lot of people don't often associate with Lewis, which is George Orwell.
I thought you were going to say Stalin.
Well, I mean, one of Orwell's most famous books is literally about Stalin. So, and really, you could argue 1984 is also about Stalin too. So, let's talk a little bit. Have you read both Animal Farm and 1984?
Just 1984.
You've not read Animal Farm.
No.
You can borrow my copy. You can read it in like 2 hours.
Yeah,
it's like
this
90
is the
pages.
one where the animals represent communism.
Exactly. Yeah. So this is kind of a critique of the USSR at that point. I believe that Animal Farm came out in the mid 40s, like 44, 45. Like right near the end of World War II, and 1984 obviously came out in 1984. It came out later. I do know that 1984 is 1949. I know that one. So both of these books have come out before The Last Battle here, obviously. Okay. We know that Lewis and Orwell read each other's works. We actually know this, right? Orwell really enjoyed That Hideous Strength, except for the religious elements to it, but we know that he really liked some of the dystopian work that he finds inside of there. And Lewis talked about both of Orwell's books, Animal Farm and 1984. I actually don't think... Actually, I'll pull something up because I do have something to share in a minute. I don't think Lewis loved 1984. I think he enjoyed Animal Farm much, much more. But for those who have not read Animal Farm before, it's about a bunch of pigs who kind of rise up against an oppressive farmer, and slowly in this kind of satire that Orwell is telling, the pigs themselves become totalitarian leaders, right? Where they have all these laws and all these commandments that I think there's 7 commandments given, or maybe it's 10. That's 7. Maybe it's, I can't remember. I have not read either 1984 or Animal Farm since high school, although I need to reread both of them. But they get to, at some point for Animal Farm, as these pigs, the main pig being Napoleon, who does really represent Stalin. They have rules at first that says something like, 4 legs is better than 2 legs, but eventually it becomes, well, actually 4 legs is good, but 2 legs is best, or something like that. In fact, they get to the law that eventually overcomes all their other commandments is all animals are equal, but some animals
are more equal
than others, right? Very famously. And so I want to actually share a little bit about that Marvin Hinton wrote about this, because there's obviously some pretty clear connections between Animal Farm and between The Last Battle. So Marvin Hinton is in his chapter on The Last Battle in The Keys to the Chronicles, which you can find links to purchase that on our website or in the episode description. He talks about Orwell and about Animal Farm and 1984 and The Last Battle. And here is what he has to say. Hinton says, while it is difficult to determine to what extent Lewis might have borrowed from Orwell, it is at least intriguing to note several parallels between Shift in The Last Battle and the leaders of Animal Farm. Shift begins wearing clothes. He walks on 2 legs rather than 4. He makes the other animals serve him. He wears weapons. He perpetually creates new work for the other animals to do. He becomes more authoritative and less frequently seen as time passes. He takes up drinking, and he continually tells the other animals he is doing all this for their own good and that they will be living in a land that is better because of it. All of these actions are taken as well by Napoleon in Animal Farm. Perhaps some of these likenesses are simply a feature of any animal taking power over other animals, but the exceptional number of similarities would seem to indicate some debt of Lewis to Orwell. He then goes on just to say this short thing as well later on the next page. In Animal Farm, the 7 Commandments. Oh, so it is 7 Commandments. That's where I was trying to think it was 7 or 10, and there we go. I guess I'm getting my Exodus and Animal Farm confused. So he writes, in Animal Farm, the 7 Commandments undergo gradual change and finally change into a single commandment which directly opposes the original 7. Lewis does something similar in The Last Battle, where Schiff says to the other animals, "What do you know about freedom? You think freedom means doing what you like. Well, you're wrong. This isn't true freedom. True freedom means doing what I tell you." Who can read this without being reminded of Orwell's line, "Freedom is slavery," especially when on the next page of the book, Schiff says, "Tash is Aslan, Aslan is Tash." As noted above, although Lewis did not greatly like 1984, he thought the linguistic part was superb. Yeah. The extent of the debt remains unclear, but definitely George Orwell's writing had an influence on The Last Battle.
Absolutely.
You can start to see a lot of that too, especially this idea of changing language, which, wow, that's something really relevant to us here in the 21st century.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I remember things like the Ministry of Peace, which is in charge of war. And
yep.
Yeah, dark stuff.
One of the things that I find so interesting about this connection between Orwell and between Lewis is, and I don't know if you feel this way, Orwell's one of those guys. I love Animal Farm. I love 1984. I still think for books that I haven't read since high school, I probably think about them, quite a bit compared to maybe other books that I haven't read since
Isn't
high
that
school.
Incredible? I'm so glad that I hated it at the time, except for the dystopian ones. I actually like those.
Yeah.
But all the things that we were required to read.
I don't think I was required to read either of them.
Really? I always assumed that everyone had to read Brave New World in 1984, but it doesn't seem like that existed outside of my school.
No, I know for a fact. I first read 1984 as a freshman just for fun, because I knew a lot of things about it. I wanted to read it, and then I reread it my senior year, and it was never signed for school. I am now trying to think. We may have. I know I read it. I read Animal Farm twice as well too. I read it. I think I probably read 1984 and then picked up Animal Farm just right after it, my freshman year. But now I'm thinking I took a course, it was like AP Modern European History or something like that, and I think we read Animal Farm, or at least we looked at it I'd already read it once before, so I'm trying to remember if I actually did the reading for class because I might not have. But no, I mean there are books that I think a lot of people do read. You're right. They stick with us, but Orwell's one of those guys where a lot of things get called Orwellian that aren't Orwellian, right? And it gets thrown around, and this show does not get into politics at all or anything like that. It gets thrown around by both sides of the spectrum, right? Anything that you don't like is Orwellian, right? And it's funny because we all, universally that book is praised, and universally that book is loved, or feared maybe is the better word. Yeah. And so it feels like a great gotcha if you say, well, what you're doing is like Big Brother, right? You feel like you've got somebody. Yeah. Which one, just as a classical educator and someone who loves teaching literature, I love the way that like appealing to a work of imaginative fiction is this big gotcha. Like, what does that say about us as imaginative humans and about the way that God created us as sub-creators? That like one of the biggest ways we can get somebody is by accusing them of doing something by a fictitious entity, right? Like that just says something so great about our imaginations, which I love. But that's maybe that's a different podcast or a different talk for another day. But
it does show how much power fiction has.
Oh, absolutely.
And how we have our own fictions, and it's not that we're pulling fiction and applying it to the real world. It's that we're pulling fiction and applying it to someone else's fiction that exists in the real world.
And one of the things that I've always, Orwell's one of those guys that you're always just like a little bit afraid to be like, I really like Orwell. Only because a lot of people say that. Maybe I'm just kind of like, I don't know. I'm not a hipster by any means, but like maybe that part comes out of me. And I
know exactly what you mean. I really liked Neutral Milk Hotel.
Oh, sure. That's
a big, before it was mentioned on.
What was it mentioned on?
Parks and Rec.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, Audrey said, so she's asked, Aubrey Plaza's character is asked what her favorite band is.
That would make sense for her.
She says Neutral Milk Hotel.
Of course.
And he's really upset that it's not Mousetrap.
Oh, yeah.
But I just thought, now everyone's going to look that
No, but
up.
everybody was already listening to that album. It was huge when it came out in the 90s.
I know. And the fact that I heard about it shows that it was popular because I wasn't...
You and I were too young. Like, I didn't listen to it when it came out.
I wasn't digging through crates trying to find like this cool thing. It's like someone played it and I heard it because it was popular.
You heard that singing Saul and you're like, what?
Gosh, it's so good. I love that.
Yeah, check it out, everybody. In an airplane. Is it over or across the sea?
In an airplane over the sea.
Yeah. So yeah, but it's interesting that Lewis and Orwell had very different outlooks on not just spirituality, but on government and on politics as well too. Do find this kind of camaraderie in their writing, right? And I love this fact that Lewis is probably somewhat indebted to some of the work that Schiff does. It's what's so interesting about this is that Orwell is somewhat indebted to Lewis's work in that hideous strength, right? When he's writing, particularly 1984, but then Lewis is then going back to 1984 and Animal Farm for The Last Battle. So it's like this kind of cyclical thing. Yeah. I don't think Orwell wrote anything after the 50s. I don't think he wrote anything in the 60s. I'm not even sure when he passed away. The only two books I know by him is that. And then that one, he wrote that really famous essay I'm trying to think of. Orwell did, and I'm totally blanking on it. But I thought this was something just really interesting I came across in Hinton that I wanted to share. As we keep moving on, I just want to think about this from the perspective of Lewis's nonfiction writing too. And Peter Shakel in The Way into Narnia pointed me to an essay that I had not read yet called "Is Progress Possible?" It came out in 1958. I think you can find it today in God in the Dock. And Shakel pointed to this essay kind of in relation to what Schiff is saying and like speaking about, no, freedom is just obeying me. And that Lewis is actually injecting a little bit of his kind of views on the political landscape of the 1950s. Lewis had said in some of his writings and letters that he was a little bit wary of kind of the stronger power that governments got in a post-World War II landscape, that we started to see more bureaucratic work. We started to see more kind of governmental, intrusion maybe is too pejorative, but maybe from Lewis's perspective, that's what he's thinking on kind of day-to-day things. And Lewis is not like, by no means, at least I don't think he's a libertarian in reading any of his things like that, but he was still concerned about these things. And Lewis was always wise in the way that he went about things. He was never polemic. He more would share concerns of his, but always do it in a pretty generous way.
Can you define polemic?
He wasn't purposefully divisive.
Okay.
Right? He wasn't purposefully divisive in this writing. Like, he took stands, but he always sought to at least understand the other side, even if he's poking holes in their logic, but not just, I'm going to say this to just kind of be controversial or to be ugly towards someone else. Well, in Is Progress Possible?, I wanted to read 2 paragraphs that Lewis actually wrote. And this is also a great pause to mention a new podcast, which I don't think we've mentioned before yet, that came out last year called Lesser Known Lewis. Have I told you about Lesser Known Lewis?
Yeah, I've begun the process of listening to
it. Maybe I can't remember if it's only come up on the Dancing Lawn or not, so I wanted to mention it. And hey, if we mentioned it 2 times, then that's fine. It's
bonus.
It's a great podcast by 2 buds who read through the lesser-known works of Lewis. They read through his essays, which is really exciting. And so they have not, as of this recording, they have not covered Is Progress Possible? But hey, it might be there in the future. They might cover it. Maybe they've covered it by the time we go out. I don't know what their plans are. Yeah. But here's what Lewis says in Is Progress Possible? This is writing in 1958, simply 1 year after this book is published. No, sorry, 2 years after The Last Battle is published. He says this: "This would be no more than an extreme application of the political philosophy implicit in most modern communities. It has stolen on us unawares. 2 wars necessitated vast curtailments of liberty, and we have grown, though grumblingly, accustomed to our change. The increasingly complexity and precariousness of our economic life have forced government to take over many spheres of activity once left to choice or chance. Our intellectuals have surrendered first to the slave philosophy of Hegel, then to Marx, and finally to the linguistic analysts. As a result, classical political theory, with its stoical, Christian, and juristic key conceptions, has died. The modern state exists not to protect our rights, but to do us good or make us good. Anyway, to do something to us or to make us something. Hence the new name leaders for those who were once rulers. We are less their subjects than their wards, pupils, or domestic animals. There is nothing left of which we can say to them, mind your own business. Our whole lives are their business."
That part about rulers becoming leaders is really interesting to me. What an interesting shift.
Lewis, and like I said, he's not being polemic here, but he's telling you his feelings, his opinions, his thoughts here, and very concerned that this modern state is instead not just existing to protect the rights that are given to us, right, or that are inalienable, right, but instead it's there to make us better people. Lewis would say, no, that was always the job of religion or of philosophy or these other things, but instead it's kind of shifted towards it's the government's job to make us better. And that's what we see in Shift, right? The Shift is doing that. No. You don't understand. You don't understand what freedom is. Let me show you, right? Yeah. And I like the fact that Lewis is like, at least when we called them rulers, we at least acknowledge what they truly were. Now we call them leaders. We don't, it's about them kind of leading our lives as opposed to ruling over us. Very interesting from Lewis. We don't see this side of him very often.
Yeah. I'm so curious what led to the phrase nanny state kind of comes up.
Yeah.
I'm curious what were the big factors that led to this? I think that part of it is you're now everyone's specializing in stuff. So you're not just educating your kid and farming and doing all these other things. Now you have one little piece, you have the Industrial Revolution. Now you do this one little piece and you have other people take care of the other parts. Mm-hmm. And we need people to be a certain level of educated, and we're gonna have this process, and then that gets you into the factories, and then even with the things like the entire kind of STEM program, everything works toward the war effort. So it's like, oh wow, we need people to make better bombs. So, and that's not the only piece, but it seems like the big focus is at that time, or let's push physics, and we're also discovering more and more things too. But yeah, it used to be that there wasn't quite so many things to have control over. You didn't have the ability to, but then we have, processes, and we're having larger and larger corporations, and just you're able to control more. Mm-hmm. But then there are bigger threats, which kind of speeds everything up. Yeah. It's like, well, you'd rather contribute to your own government getting bigger so that they can protect you from the other government on the other side.
I think it's kind of the inverse of Lewis is maybe thinking more of the idea of Cincinnatus, right? In Rome, and kind of taking this, kind of becoming a temporary dictator, but then going back to, working on his farm and stuff.
Didn't he do it 3 times?
He did it multiple times. I don't remember how many times, but yeah. What you see with Lewis being concerned about is this idea that even democratic states had to give up, in this kind of push towards collectivism that was required in order to win these wars. He was feeling like, well, we haven't gone back though. Those kind of that once you give a little, you can't really take it back. Yeah. And that was some of Lewis's thought here. And I think that's what he's kind of knocking on with Shift here. Even this idea, not just saying we'll have all these things, this big bureaucracy, we'll do it. Narnia doesn't need these. Narnia doesn't need offices. Narnia doesn't need schools. I'm an educator, but Narnia doesn't. And there have been some schools, but it's not like they need when we saw schools back in Caspian, they don't need, whips, muzzles, saddles. He's kind of creating things that Lewis would say, Narnia is this kind of almost utopian. It's not a utopia, but it's this beautiful naturalistic place and world, right? Whereas he's kind of making it to be more, almost more quote unquote, what we might think in the West of civilized, right? But Lewis is saying almost as if that's a bad thing, right? And even this idea of putting everything into Aslan's treasury for everyone's good, this Lewis, again, clearly putting this in the mouth of the villain of the story is kind of him pushing back against collectivism, right? Here, which is just interesting because we see very little of this from Lewis. Lewis rarely opens up his thoughts to us about, how a state should be run, right? And even here, I'm sure people could push back with us and say, well, this is Lewis just writing this in the same way that, when he's railing against the headmistress being put into Parliament and stuff, he's really just railing against all government. And I think that is an extent to it. I don't think he's necessarily saying, oh, I'm part of I don't remember what they're called in the UK, the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. Is that the two parties, I think?
Sounds good.
They have more than a two-party system.
My people left hundreds of
we don't care anymore.
We don't really do that anymore.
But I couldn't go past this without mentioning it because it's something unique that Lewis is doing here in the 7th book in this series.
This is not super related to Narnia, but it's just really interesting to hear someone that I respect so much as Lewis make comments about something that was so long ago. I wasn't even a part of that. I didn't experience any of that. I've just read it from this, 40, 50 year later point of view, for the first time. But, it's just interesting to hear someone critique the system that that's I feel like that's what we have now. And you and I have always grown up with. I feel like I would describe our government as big government. Um, would you agree with that?
Describe what? Say it one more time.
I feel like you and I have grown up in a like the government does a ton of stuff.
Oh, absolutely. Sure,
and
sure.
I would describe that as big government.
Yeah, we go. Yeah, it's very much. I think that's. I mean, yeah, just post World War II is a very different form of kind of ruling,
And
right?
and
Although
for
that's not
us,
the word
we
use
we
anymore,
don't
but
know anything
I don't know
else.
any different, right?
Right.
Yeah,
We didn't grow up with like a monarchy or
I don't know any
anything like that.
different from like personal experience. I can understand different from ideological or philosophical ideas, but not from my own personal experience. No, the way things are is kind of how they've often been for me.
And so it's interesting to hear someone critiquing a system when I really think he's critiquing imperfect people working within a system that is also not perfect. But it's interesting to hear that system being critiqued when it's all I've ever known. And as far as I know, it's the best system we have. That because it's the only one we've had.
The only one you and I have experienced.
Right.
Well, let's keep moving on here to wrap up the chapter, because the last thing that happens is Shift makes a claim for Narnian universalism, right? He says Tash is Aslan, Aslan is Tash. And in fact, when there's a question, right, when there's a question about maybe this isn't true, right, he responds with, "You silly little bleater," when he speaks of this sheep. Of course, it's a sheep that speaks up right here, right? And he says, "Go home to your mother and drink milk." He speaks down. He condescends towards this animal. And I thought this was great. This idea
He's being
too.
lactose intolerant.
This idea here, this is kind of Lewis critiquing this idea of that if you're defending objective monotheism, right? So monotheism that says my God is the only God. In a modernist and postmodernist lens, the critique is like, how ignorant are you? You're childish. Like, you really think yours is, how it's, you
that
see
may
this.
have been fine 100 years ago, but we know better now.
Yeah, exactly.
Is the
And,
reaction.
if you see any kind of comment whenever there's a conflict between, not that this happens as much for us in America, but when you see about conflict between some of the bigger Abrahamic religions, right? Not bigger, there's 3 of them, right? between Islam
those are the
and
big
Christianity and Judaism, someone go on like the New York Times or Washington Post or any web, CNN, whatever, any website, and click the comments, and the first one will always be something like, all these ignorant, stupid people who don't realize they're all fighting over the same God, right? As if we're just all dumb. We don't understand that it's all this. It's like, that's, which it always bothers me, because that, and not that everyone believes that, but it's like, well, that's a pretty ignorant take too, actually, believe it or not, because monotheistic religions do believe different things, and we have often similar. There definitely is a similar history, right? Yeah. But we're actually are believing something different that makes kind of our beliefs set apart. And like, what's funny is, like, despite the fact that we have very different beliefs as Christians from the Jewish faith and from the Muslim faith, one of the things we would agree with is like, our God is different, right? Like, we would actually agree that like the Trinitarian Christian God is not the same thing as other faiths. And so,
and each one like purposely like calls that out.
Exactly.
There is only one God.
But that is one of the critiques, right? Oh, these Abrahamic religions, they just don't understand. These people are just dumb. Why can't they understand? Like me, the enlightened postmodernist, can clearly see through, despite the fact that for 2,000 years, I guess people just, 1,400 years if we're going back to the founding of Islam as well too. You're just saying, like, it's almost laughable, but that is not for many, but that is a significant belief out there. It's definitely one that has quite a bit of following behind it.
I feel like it's one of those things that it sounds good enough and it's easy enough to arrive at that conclusion kind of on your own. It's like, oh, these all have this commonality. Like, maybe they're all just the same thing. And it's a very alluring thought to have, where like, oh, like, what if it was all the same thing? That's kind of nice to, kind of nice to think. But unfortunately, that's about as far as it goes.
Yeah. But it's so interesting here that Lewis does, inject universalism into Narnia. No, Tash and Aslan are the exact same thing. Can't you see that? Aslan means no more than Tash is the words we get. And we do get the introduction of the ginger cat, but we'll talk more about this character in a later chapter. So
okay.
Any final thoughts before, as we mentioned, the chapter ends the last paragraph. Tyrion can't handle this. He speaks up, and he is knocked unconscious and being taken away.
It's pretty brutal how that happens, too.
Yeah.
Someone hits him in the face, and at the same time, someone hits him in the back of the legs, and he just goes falling. So that'll be sore in the next chapter.
Yeah.
There's one last thought.
Sure.
I think sometimes there are things that sound, at first glance or first thought, logical. Okay. Similar to like, oh, all the gods are, it's all the same thing is the phrase that I've heard quite frequently. And the thing that comes to mind is if you are just trying to think through things, you're thinking about the seasons that you go through in a year and how it gets warmer and gets colder. And you know that the earth is orbiting around the sun and that at some points it's closer to the sun and at some points it's further away. It seems like, well, the summer must be when the earth is several million miles closer to the sun because that's this source of heat and stuff. And that you could just stop right there and think that, but it's actually not true. The more you look into it, it's actually the opposite, at least for us, where the closer we are, that's during the winter time. And it turns out it's actually the angle and it doesn't match up the way you thought it did. And I feel the same way with, if you actually look at each religion, look at what their texts are saying. If you are going to pick one of them being true actually excludes the others from being true.
I mean, they're incompatible. It doesn't mean there needs to be, wars and violence or anything like that. No. This is not the Lamppost listener calling for a crusade by any means. In fact, we call for the opposite. But it does mean that, and this is kind of what Shift is getting at, is that this ignorant belief of like, well, you're just childish. And again, Lewis would probably also say some of that is chronological snobbery. Again, like one of the things that, despite some of the horrors and the terrible things that happened during the Crusades, both sides understood that there were different beliefs, right? Or at least the leaders understood. And there were other many reasons that were not so wholesome that those wars began. There were many kind of self-serving interests as well as that. But it's this idea of like, oh, like we are so much more enlightened now. We understand these ancient texts better than anyone who came before us. And they're all just childish for believing these things. There's this ignorance in and of itself and claiming that the other side is ignorant, which is interesting.
Which goes back to the language stuff.
Yep.
you call someone else ignorant even though like doing so is ignorant.
Yep. Well, let's go ahead. Let's end our time here with this chapter, Phil. And before we get to listener feedback, what do you think is going to happen next? Where are we going from here?
I think it's going to get worse.
Tell me more.
No, I'm hoping that we get a turning point where someone starts to point out that that's not really Aslan.
Sure.
Saying all that stuff.
Well, Phil, in chapter 4, which is called What Happened That Night, Tyrion will cry out to Aslan for help.
Oh.
So,
I wonder if he's the cat.
Oh, you think Aslan's actually the cat there?
Yeah.
Interesting. He's been a cat before?
Right?
He has been.
He's been an albatross? We can't rule anything out. It's probably not the ape.
Probably not the ape. That's true. Yes. All right. Well, let's go on to some listener feedback. We have a voicemail from Rachel that we're going to listen to and chat about before we wrap up for the day.
Let's hear it.
Hi there. My name is Rachel, and I live in Idaho. And I've been listening to your podcast. I found it not too long ago. Currently, I think the last episode I listened to is Chapter 4, Voyage of the Dawn Treader. So first of all, I just wanted to say it's been really fun to go through these books. They've been a really influential part of my life. Really thankful for them and also thankful for you guys just as a way to get back into them as an adult. And so anyway, what I wanted to say, you had asked in the Chapter 4 episode about Edmund and Lucy's role in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. Like, did they really have to come back? And I think they did because someone had to get Eustace to Narnia. How else is he going to get there? And how is he going to react if there's not somebody there who's been there before that he can sort of tag along with? So I think they're mostly a transitional role as far as getting Eustace into Narnia, getting him interacting with Aslan so that he can have his redemptive arc. But also I think they are still thinking that they need Narnia. And so they go back and are all excited, and they have a few important character growth moments to get them to realize that, no, actually, you are ready to just be in your world and get to know the Aslan in our world, like who he is in reality, get to know Christ. So anyway, I am sure now that it's 2022, you recorded that episode in 2019, or actually it's 2023, it's January. So, that you've talked about this already and probably came to your own conclusions. So I'll find them eventually. But anyway, those are my thoughts. Thanks so much for doing your podcast, and I look forward to what else you got. Bye.
Well, Rachel, thank you so much for getting in touch and leaving us a voicemail. I feel like that handoff is so key. I think that it really helped that we had established characters who knew Narnia, who could introduce someone like Eustace in the same way that Edmund was introduced. And what a perfect character to help with that transition, to have Edmund do that. I thought that was really, really good. For some reason, I know you're going to laugh, Daniel, but it reminded me of, I can't believe I'm going to say this, G.I. Joe 2.
Never seen it, or the first one. Don't know any of the G.I. Joes.
Or Step Up 2.
Never.
Both movies that had Channing Tatum star in the first one, and I think that he didn't super want to do the second one, but he agreed to hand over the reins. So he shows up, he's in the first 20 minutes, and then something happens to his character. Either he goes off somewhere or he gets taken out, whatever it happens, and they hand off that transition. I feel like franchises do this all the time. They're like, we can't get him for the whole movie. We'll pay him, half his fee, get him for the first 20 minutes. So people see him on the poster, they see him in the trailer, and they come in. And this is a very different thing because it's a book. But I think that it helped that we had these characters we love. We don't have all of them. We have two of them. They hand this over, and now Eustace is able to pick up.
Yeah, I think in addition to what you're saying and kind of this, and Rachel alludes to both of these things that we're about to mention, that being kind of this, Rachel is saying there's this kind of narrative piece, and that's what you're saying, Phil, where we kind of need this from a narrative perspective. But then Rachel also talks about that these characters need it from a character perspective, that this is part of their journey too. I think that's really helpful for me to think through and realize, because I think what is jarring is that these characters of Lucy and Edmund, really the two characters we've gotten to know the most throughout the first two books, for them to, if they were only there as kind of these narrative pieces to move around the board to bring Eustace in, which they are to an extent, it would feel somewhat of a disappointment. But there is this greater character thing happening. Like Rachel mentioned, they are coming into the world realizing that actually they have a couple of things they have to do, but realizing that they're ready. They're ready to go back into our world and get to know Aslan, to know our Aslan. And I think that that's really important for us as readers to see, because they're not the main characters in that book. And it's a helpful reminder that, we aren't the main characters in life, right? That's like the whole thing. That's the Gen Zers. They all say that you're not the main character. So-and-so thinks they're the main character. But it's actually, that's true. We all have a tendency to think we are the main character. We think that the story is our story. And it's like, nope, you were like the smallest supporting character in God's story, right? In the story of the world. And I think that's helpful to see Edmund and Lucy kind of play this more supporting roles. That's actually quite humbling for us as readers to see the two of them be somewhat humbled. Like, not only do they have a little bit less to do, but they have to share their crown with Caspian, who really has much more authority on that ship. Yes, I know Edmund and Lucy had been kings and queens in the past, but Caspian's the one in charge. It's Caspian and Eustace's story more than it is Lucy and Edmund's. And actually, I think that's really great to read with. If you read this in the Lord's order as the third book,
I'm dying.
then it works, because these two characters that had so much to do and carried so much clout wherever they went kind of take somewhat of a back seat. And that's a great reminder to us as readers.
Yeah. I'm thinking too about just our own story. I think that coming to know the Lord is probably the most likely part where you're the main character. But then as you go on, your story becomes more about other people
Mm-hmm.
and what you can contribute, what you can add. And I think it makes a big difference in how you approach things, like picking out a church.
Mm-hmm.
It becomes less like, how can I get the perfect church for me?
Mm-hmm.
And more of, how can I contribute
Mm-hmm.
to the church that I'm going to?
It's great wisdom to end on.
Yeah.
Well, Phil, we will be back next time with Chapter 4, but before we leave, we'd be remiss if we didn't thank those who make the show possible. This episode is made possible by our patrons over at patreon.com. If you'd like to support the show, you can listen to a bonus episode each month along with other special rewards. The special thanks goes out to John Marr, Emily Wakefield, and Ryan Smith for supporting us at our very top tiers. If you have any listener feedback, you can email us at thenarniapodcast@gmail.com or leave us a voicemail at 406-646-6733. You can find all of our previous episodes, links, and book information at lamppostlistener.com. We would appreciate a review on Apple Podcasts because this helps other listeners find the show and join together in our read-through. Thank you for joining us on this journey, and we'll be back next time with Chapter 4.
See you soon.